Welcome once again to my home in Oxford, where over the next 4 weeks I'll be joined around my kitchen table by various musicians and friends to explore a variety of musical themes. This week, Waits bands form our subject, the bands of town musicians who were once widespread throughout Britain and Europe too. So, welcome James Merryweather, a founder member of the revived York Waits, whose music we're listening to now. Also with me are Charles Spicer and Edward Fitzgibbon, who, along with me, Tim Healey, have reformed a Waits band here in Oxford. James, as a musical historian as well as a musician, what were Waits bands?
They began a very long time ago, probably in the 14th century, emerging from the old town watchman, we think. Nothing is certain, and we require to do a lot more research, but it looks as if you started with watchmen, an individual who kept a lookout for fire, for thieves and so on, and perhaps had a horn or a trumpet to keep an eye open, to mark the hours, and generally to look after the sleeping population of a grand house, a royal palace, a town or a city. But that function tended to evolve away from the guys who followed on, who became musicians. The two functions went in different directions, musician and watchman. And the police duties tended to be taken up by other fellows, and the musicians played music for the city. They were the city band, the town band. The strange thing is that they seemed to maintain their watch duties, particularly during the winter, and it looks as if this was partially functional and partially ceremonial, so that they would keep the night watches between Michaelmas and the beginning of the spring. Even if it was a small snatch of music, they could hear the Waits somewhere in the distance. They'd know somebody was keeping an eye open. The same way as we'd like to be confident that there was a Bobby on the beat out there, just watching out for any misdemeanours that might be being perpetrated.
But when they performed their more ceremonial functions, I mean, this would be what? The visit of a royal personage?
Yes.
Other civic functions, weddings?
Anything that required some ceremony, the Waits would have been called to do, particularly if the town council was involved. So that from certainly the 15th century onwards, if royalty visited, as they did frequently to York, to Norwich, the big cities, the Waits would be wheeled out and put up on a scaffold on the gateway to the city and would play grand music as they arrived. They would lead processions. They could be hired to play for weddings. They could be hired to play for hunt-ups, which was an early morning alarm call.
You mentioned the Norwich Waits. Now, I know that the Norwich Waits also had a terrific reputation for musical excellence. I mean, there was a famous occasion when Will Kemp, a well-known clown, jester of the Elizabethan period, performed his 9 Days Wonder. This was, he danced his way all the way from London to Norwich, where he was greeted. It's a measure of his celebrity, I think. He was greeted by the Norwich Waits and spoke very, very highly of them. Such Waits, he said, few cities in our realm have the like, none better, who besides their excellency in wind instruments, their cunning on the viol and violin, their voices be admirable, every one of them able to serve in any cathedral church in all Christendom for choristers. Excellency on wind instruments. This was the core sound of the Waits bands everywhere, wasn't it? Charles Spicer, what kind of wind instruments are we talking about?
Well, from the earliest times, we're talking about shawms, accompanied by the sackbut, which was a brass instrument, I suppose, developed into the modern trombone. The shawms one can think of as being early forms of the oboe, I guess, and they changed their shape and therefore their sound through the centuries. The classic lineup was 2 shawms and 1 sackbut, but it is thought that from lots of illustrations that it's possible that in certain places there were 3 shawm players and 1 sackbut player who was expected to carry on going, but one of the shawm players acted as a substitute, so there were always 2 playing and 1 sort of taking a break.
Right.
It's hard work blowing a shawm.
Well, James has actually brought his shawm along and is going to give us a demonstration. It's a marvellous-looking instrument, marvellous piece of wood, about 1 yard long, I'd say, very long and straight, coming to a horn shape at the end. And, James, how do it go?
This is the alto shawm, which is the middle voice in the shawm band. And in a minute, we'll hear the sopranos followed by the full shawm band, but the alto, just on its own, would sound...
If you could hear how our kitchen is resonating to that mighty sound. Fantastic. That's the sound of the alto shawm, and now we're going to hear another musical interlude from the York Waits with the soprano shawms leading off with the tune. Fantastic for outdoor entertainment and grand banqueting halls, of course, but for indoor affairs, they did have other instruments too to draw on. Kemp, for example, you'll remember, refers to the viol and the violin and magnificent choral singing. There were also the strung instruments like the cittern and lute. Edward Fitzgibbon, when did the lute enter the musical landscape?
The earliest pictures that we have of the lute being used in Europe are actually very, very early, 11th and 12th century. In manuscript form, tiny little painted watercolour images, often accompanying writing, which show very primitive forms of lute, very small in the body, often with only 3 strings. And it's now thought that the lute entered Europe through 2 main channels. Firstly, through the Spanish Empire of the Moors in the 9th and 10th centuries, and then, of course, through the Crusades and through the connections with Byzantium and Venice.
We should say what the lute looks like. It's basically a guitar type of instrument, but with a big pear-shaped kind of body.
Pear-shaped body, yes.
And,
with a rounded back, like a very large mandolin, and a flat soundboard.
And in your case, how many strings?
Well, I've got 21 strings on this type of lute. This is a typical lute that would have been used around 1640 to, say, 1680. It's called a luto attiorbato, which means a theorboed lute. And that's basically a Renaissance lute, which sounds like this, to which I added a number of diapason basses, which sound like this. This gives you a very deep bass register, so you can play basso continuo on it as well.
It's tremendous resonance,
yes,
actually.
Indeed.
Yeah. And we know that Waits musicians certainly did use the lute, probably for the private events more than the grand ceremonial occasions.
Yes, we don't know what he did with it, but John Girdler, one of the York Waits, who died in 1666, in his will, it states that he had a theorby lute, exactly as Edward has here. So presumably used for indoor work, broken consort. He had a very wide variety of instruments, as did his brother, both Waits at the time.
Returning to the wind band, we know that the shawm bands died out around, what would you say, James?
Well, in York, somewhere around 1596, so around 1600, and reed instruments of the loud shawm type didn't come back in again, probably in most towns, until 1700 with the invention of the oboe.
And in the new consorts, to hold down the bass line, you had this fantastic apparatus, looked a bit like a beautiful wooden bazooka, the kirtle.
It's simply the ancestor of the bassoon, which was extended and broken into joints, which presumably made it easier to manufacture, because this has bores over a yard long, which is quite a task for the maker.
Let's hear what it sounds like, James.
Just like the bassoon. But this would have formed the base to earlier with the shawm band in some circumstances, but in the 17th century, the cornets, which are not relations of the brass instrument, the cornet with 2 T's, which was a wooden instrument with finger holes and a trumpet-like mouthpiece. These would have taken the upper lines. The middle lines would have been taken by the trombones, the sackbut, and the bass by the kirtle, in certain cities. We know this happened in York. In other cities, the lyssadine often found its way in, which is one of the serpent family. But we really shouldn't get into that too deeply.
No. What I want to do at the moment is to introduce listeners also to something that was this was the absolute mainstay of village music. The pipe and tabor, fantastic. The pipe, if people have never seen one played by the musician in one hand, whilst beating the drum with another. Charles, you're something of an expert.
Well, thank you for saying that. The pipe has only 3 holes, and it manages to get a full range of notes by overblowing, the sort of thing that a youngster first beginning the recorder might do by mistake. So tape up those extra holes, and off they go, pipe and tabering.
Fantastic.
The tabors come in various different sizes. Your chap that you've mentioned earlier, Will Kemp, of course, there's a famous picture of him playing a pipe which is really quite long, and with a long tabor by his side. These would probably have been used fairly extensively in the theatre for what was called the jig. At the end of all the serious entertainment, there'd be the song and dance man, and quite often this function was performed by the company clown. And I don't mean that he was disliked by the rest of the people, but just that was his job. He would have played the clown in the Shakespeare play or the Jonson play or whatever, and then come on at the end and done a bit of pipe and tabering and dancing too.
Marvellous. It came in, the Crusades probably, didn't it, I think?
I think the origin of all these instruments is very similar to what Ed was saying about the lutes and other percussion instruments as well. Yes,
we were musically low-tech by comparison with the Arab world, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely right, yes. Yeah.
So, Charles, give us a go on the pipe and tabor.
See how we go.
You have to understand that all these instruments we're talking about were in the repertoire of the Waits bands, but in some small towns they might have no more than one Wait, the town piper, whose main instrument might well be that very same pipe and tabor.
Yes, indeed, Tim. The piper meant many things. There's a great quote here, actually, from a Presbyterian divine called Richard Baxter. He was from Shropshire, and he wrote this in about 1696. One of my father's own tenants was the town piper, hired by the year for many years together, and the place of the dancing assembly was not 100 yards from our door. And we could not, on the Lord's day, either read a chapter, or pray, or sing a psalm, or catechize, or instruct a servant, but with the noise, the pipe and tabor, and the hootings in the street continually in our ears.
Quite. How many, James, would you say, how many of these Waits bands were there around Britain in their heyday?
Every town and city of any note had its own band of Waits, or a Wait. You've mentioned a town piper with pipe and tabor, and up in the north of England, he could have been a bagpiper, and in Scotland. But the list is, in this country, of places which have recorded Waits. It comes to over 120. You've got Aberdeen, Alnwick, Ashbourne, Barnstaple, Barton-upon-Humber, Bath, Berwick-upon-Tweed, Beverley, Bewley, etc., etc. It goes on forever, everywhere in Britain and in Europe.
And what about your own York Waits?
The York ones, we are fortunate in that their beginning and their end is well documented, and the middle is also well documented because the city records are some of the most complete in the country. And so it's been possible to follow their history from their origin in the first mention in 1434 right to their demise in 1836.
They wore grand ceremonial outfits, didn't they?
Indeed they did. Our ancestors had scarlet coats for most of their time and would have worn fairly dramatic hats of the period. All this worn over the ordinary clothes of an ordinary professional musician, which just being clothes, plus a chain noting their office, a very extravagant gilt silver chain with a scutcheon on the bottom, which is the arms of the city. And a few of these survive from Bristol, Norwich, King's Lynn and so on to tell us that Waits had this insignia to show who they were and that they were important.
So we've seen their costume, as it were, but do the actual personalities of any of the York Waits come through?
They come through very strongly occasionally. My friend John Girdler, who I mentioned earlier with the Thornbury lute, had an enormous family, most of whom sadly died in infancy, but it's been possible to trace this. And he was appointed in, I think, 1623 to restart the band in the new Century Quarter there. And he co-opted his sons, and they became a little dynasty. And when the Civil War came along, there's a lovely record saying that in view of the extreme poverty of this city, John Girdler and his sons are now no longer to serve their place as waits. The city could not afford to keep them on. That shows in all the records as well. The Civil War is a great gap. There were no waits. They just couldn't keep them going. Nothing to do with Cromwell having a downer on music.
No.
Simply no money. But other personalities in the 16th century, the end of the 16th century, there was a wonderful set of musicians playing shawms and sackbut for very grand occasions, including John Balderston and John Clark, who were drunks. Now, we mustn't let these very jolly stories detract from the fact that these were all hard-working professional council employees.
But nonetheless,
it was enormous fun. It's enormous fun to read that John Clark and Balderston, two of the waits, did personally appear in this court before my Lord Mayor and were examined touching their evil and disorderly behaviour. They went abroad in the country in evil apparel, and they could not play so cunningly upon their instruments as they ought to do. And they were sacked, and then they were reinstated. But then poor old John Clark again was brought before my Lord Mayor because he has become so disordered and distempered, and such a person as will be very often drunk, and is at diverse times troubled with a falling sickness, and his hearing unperfect or almost deaf, that he is not sufficient to serve his place. And that was the end of the Shawm Band in York due to drunkenness. And they had to draft in from outside some more sober gentlemen to take over.
So from out of all these various town bands, we know a little bit of the type of music they played, and one of the slightly controversial things is they're often referred to as having had signature tunes. I say slightly controversial because it seems to me they're more likely to have been kind of tunes written in tribute to the Waits bands rather than the actual theme music, the signature tune of the Waits band itself. Some of the tunes don't lend themselves at all well to ceremonial music. Having said that, here is the tune of the London Waits, which many people will recognise. Past 3 o'clock and a cold frosty morning are the lyrics often associated with that tune.
Yes, and that very clearly depicts the night watch duties of the Waits. And that occurs in the tune, or the ballad, York Waits, in which it's not past 3 o'clock, it's past 3 fair frosty morn, good morrow my masters all. It does look as if this was a well-known call, familiar to the people. Extraordinary,
though. I mean, did they really go on playing at past 3 o'clock in the morning in, shall we say, the 17th century? Why? Didn't it annoy the neighbours? I mean, keep people from their sleep?
They were ordered to get up and start their rounds at 3 or 4 in the morning, and there seems to be evidence that they took their instruments with them and possibly played.
Yes, there are references to Waits playing in all weathers as well as playing at all hours. I've got another little quote here. This is from around about 1680. It's anonymous. It runs thus. The public waits who liveries do own, and badges of a city or some town, who are retained in constant yearly pay, do at their solemn public meetings play, and up and down the streets and town in cold dark nights, when the instruments they scarce can hold, they play about and tell what hour it is, and weather too. This course they do not miss, most part of winter in the nights.
I know this has a particular resonance for you, Charles.
It's very personal, this.
Actually,
yes.
Our first civic engagement as the Oxford Waits was to play for the City Council outside the Oxford ice rink on a freezing New Year's Eve as part of a beacon lighting millennium celebration.
Yes, it was freezing. We were outside the ice rink, and I'd have preferred to have been in the ice rink than outside that evening.
It was that cold.
It was that cold. We only had to play for a short time, maybe 40 minutes, but the percussionist could scarcely hold a stick in his hand, and my problem playing various wind instruments was that I couldn't, after a while, find the holes in the instrument. I started off playing bagpipes, and of course bagpipe reeds get cold and moist and start playing out of key. James is rolling his eyes in sympathy.
I think we've all found this. As soon as we start to try to become the Waits and learn what it was like to be one, we find out how uncomfortable and unpleasant
Indeed.
it could be. Also, how grand and satisfying it can be when the weather is good. If we have a mild winter, the procession is comfortable. But yes, indeed, there are times when your fingers are so frost-nipped, some notes are slipped.
Unthinkable, really. I mean, just about playable on wind instruments and things like that. But Edward's lute, I don't think, would be given a cat in hell's chance on a frosty day out of
Your hands
doors.
would become paralysed. Yes.
But just going back to the idea of the so-called signature tunes, we did discover a tune which turns up in a couple of 18th century dance collections titled The Oxford Waits. It's a sabelle, a type of English gavotte anyway, and it doesn't actually trip very easily off the fingers of a wind player or a fiddler, but we did find that it lent itself naturally to the keyboard or to the lute, which suggests to me that it was more like a tune written in tribute to the Oxford Waits rather than their own theme tune. Edward, you might like to give us a go
Yes,
at
indeed.
it.
And here it comes.
About 1712, we lose all trace of the Oxford Waits that I've been able to locate in the city acts. And I think this perhaps mirrors a more widespread decline in the Waits tradition in Britain.
Yes, you're right. I think the development of the concert was one of the culprits, that music making became a thing that other professionals did. People weren't just ceremonial musicians, they were concert playing musicians. Composers were writing for them, and therefore the Waits became unfashionable. And then, 1836, along comes the Municipal Corporations Reform Act, which got rid of a lot of ancient and now unnecessary, unfashionable civic officials.
Not just the Waits.
Not just the Waits, the tipstaffs, the bellmen.
Who were the tipstaffs?
I believe they whipped people. And the bellman was the town crier, and he disappeared as well in many cases. And that was the end of them. But they were missed. The population was unhappy not to have this jolly music around at Christmas. They were still remembered. Indeed, some people today still remember the word Waits in its relationship with carol singers.
Absolutely, yeah.
And straight after 1836, we see the rise of the Christmas Waits. In 1843, you get Punch starting to satirise the Christmas Waits, the Christmas carol singers. And this goes on, particularly in Punch and the Illustrated London News. There are lots of illustrations of satire and of fun-making against these amateur carol singers who were operative throughout the country.
Yes, and I've got a favourite quote here, if you'll allow me to read it. It's from George Bernard Shaw's diary, 1889, and you'll tell what time of year it is. "The only music I have heard this week is Waits, to sit up working until 2 or 3 in the morning, and then, just as I am losing myself in my first sleep, to hear Venite Adoramus welling forth from a cornet English pitch, a saxhorn Society of Arts pitch or thereabouts, and a trombone French pitch is the sort of thing that breaks my peace and destroys my goodwill towards men."
They weren't popular.
No, not at all.
But they're still on our Christmas cards, gathered round a lantern in the snow.
Indeed.
So the Waits died. And yet They rose again, did they not? I think probably, James, you and your fellow founder members of the York Waits were the first people to bring a Waits band back to life, in full costume, I have to say.
It was all the fault of a group of imaginative chaps living in a house in York, and one who was researching Lord Mayors and came across jolly stories about Waits, infected another one, and he gathered people around him and reformed the band and started kitting them out with costume.
You've been going for how many decades now?
2 and a bit.
2 and a bit?
Yes, we're all getting a bit too old for the job. And blowing shawms is becoming very hard work, particularly on processions when going uphill.
How much more agreeable, then, to organise a conference of Waits bands, which I know is your forthcoming project. You're organising a grand international conference of Waits bands to be held next year, that's the year 2002, where?
July in York, as part of York Early Music Festival. And we're hoping to gather people from all over the place to come and contribute to a phenomenon about which we know a lot, but by no means enough. And there are many, many questions outstanding. And we've been saying things today which have a rather poor foundation in fact. We need to gather those facts and get some real truth.
It's all part, I would say, of a kind of ongoing rethinking of history where you're not necessarily looking at the lives of the kings and the courtiers, but of the people who entertained them.
Yes.
That their lives are as valid, in a sense, as the lives of royalty.
Far more interesting.
Well, thank you, James Merryweather, Edward Fitzgibbon and Charles Spicer. We're going to play you out now with a grand rapprochement of the Oxford Waits and the York Waits, a tune called Fill Every Glass.
Fill every glass, for wine inspires us and fires us with courage, love and joy. Women and wine should life employ. Is there aught else on earth desirous? Fill every glass, for wine inspires us and fires us with courage, love and joy. Fill every glass, for wine inspires us and fires us with courage, love and joy. Women and wine should life employ. Is there aught else on earth desirous? Fill every glass, for wine inspires us and fires us with courage, love and joy.